On AM 560, The Answer.
Get the latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Kentucky Senator Rand Paul has drawn the ire of President Trump. No surprise there. You knew they were going to be in an impasse on this approach to international trade. Rand Paul, doing a podcast for Reason Magazine, had this to say about what he has heard back from businesses in his state of Kentucky in the early stages of the imposition of tariffs, and now the pause on some tariffs and the imposition of higher tariffs.
I have the farmers who call me and they say, well, we export about 20% of what we sell, but we're still suffering from the tariffs in the previous Trump administration in 2018, 2019. The bourbon industry contacts me and says, well, retaliatory tariffs by Europe and Canada and other countries will hurt our exports of bourbon. I have shippers, international shippers and domestic shippers who also do international. They say it'll hurt them. Home builders say, well, if lumber and steel go up, the price of houses will go up. And already we have high interest rates and we already have inflation in homes. So I really don't get anybody coming to me and say, please have tariffs. Also, they're worried about the tariffs.
Yeah, right. Everybody wants tariffs retracted. Well, what does that say about the underlying policy to begin with? And also, again, as I've said many times, what we understand about central planning and its effectiveness. Rand Paul just sort of baselining it here a little bit when it comes to talk on trade.
Trade has been growing exponentially, international trade. But you know what else has been growing exponentially? GDP. GDP per capita is growing exponentially over 70 years. And so trade is actually proportional. And so we have to actually have the fundamental debate, is trade good or bad? And without question, the statistics overwhelmingly say trade is good. We're getting richer. 100,000 people escape poverty every day because of capitalism and its extension, trade.
Yes, international trade is good. Main Street and Wall Street are not disconnected. I'm trying to get through all of the shibboleths that are bandied about in these times. Another one is on trade deficits. And again, I've addressed it, so I'll cede my time to Art Laffer, his conversation, who's a supporter of President Trump, who wrote the Unleash Prosperity book with Steve Moore about Trump's second term and is generally maintains his support and advocacy for Trump policies, except here, because there's some basic things that are said or are used as predicates to policy choices that are not true, like the rap you keep hearing on trade deficits.
The trade deficit is not a problem. If you get people to bring their businesses back to the U.S., to load up their machines in Mexico, to drive them up over the border so they now employ Americans and not Mexicans, if you do that because we have good policies, that's called a Mexican trade surplus and a U.S. trade deficit. Trade deficits are capital surpluses. That's when you bring the capital home. So anything that says the trade deficit is bad is completely wrong. The U.S. needs a trade deficit because that's a capital surplus. When Reagan's tax cuts took effect on January 1st, 1983, the U.S. went into a huge trade deficit as the economy boomed beyond belief. Everyone was trying to invest in the United States, Larry. And what do you want? Capital lined up in your borders trying to get into your country or trying to get out of your country? Of course you want them to come into the country, and that's what happened with Reagan. And by the way, that's what's going to happen with Trump with its phenomenal policies. What he has done and all the rest of the policies are spectacular.
Right, and we're waiting with bated breath for that budget resolution to move out of the House so that an extension of tax cuts with the addition of a few others can be advanced. Norbert Michel is the Vice President Director of the Cato Institute Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. He joins us now. Norbert Michel, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hi, thanks for having me this morning.
So one of the other canards that's bandied about is that free trade hollowed out the middle class, and I know you wrote about it. So could you address that?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of shibboleths, as you put it, and this is a big one. This is this idea that somebody needs to come in and save the middle class because it's been decimated over the last 40 or 50 years is completely wrong, because the statistics just literally prove that they have not been decimated. Middle class has done very well. So has the class right beneath the middle class. If you look over the last 40 or 50 years, the number of American households earning, and this is inflation adjusted, earning more than $100,000 has more than tripled. And if you look at the share earning under $35,000, that share has gone down. So what does that mean? That means people have been moving up the income ladder, and it's pretty much steadily over the last 5 decades. If you measure income, say, roughly 10 different ways, there's only going to be one way that you can find that shows that it's been stagnant. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of those populist folks focus on to try to prove their case. But you can't do that. There are lots of different ways to look at income, lots of different time periods. You have to look at the whole picture, and the whole picture is really good. People have done very, very well.
But the pictures that are dreary are the company towns that used to have a U.S. Steel plant or Bethlehem Steel plant or another big manufacturing facility that shuttered and moved some or all of their operations offshore. And this is what people focus in on. And you're empathetic to people who lose their jobs, just as we have been empathetic to people who've lost their jobs in the federal government. But at some point, some things have to give. And that's just the nature of it, particularly in the private sector as opposed to the public. And so I don't want to just say like these things happen, like there's no interest in those people, because there is. But sure, not everybody is winning all at the same time every time.
No, that's right. And I mean, look, I am sympathetic to anyone who loses their job, anyone. But the truth of the matter is that the service sector, not the manufacturing sector, the service sector, has accounted for a larger share of the U.S. labor force since the Civil War, and a larger share than agriculture since the early 1900s. The service sector has always been the key driver of income and wealth in the United States, almost literally always. Look, the share of total jobs in the manufacturing sector, it didn't just start going down in 2000 when China joined the WTO. It didn't just start going down in 1994 when we created NAFTA. It's been dropping since World War II. and it's not just in the United States. It's in all developed countries. And the reason is productivity. Our technology has improved across the board, and throughout the world, we can produce more things with fewer people. And that's been the nature of the economy throughout the developed world for a very long time.
So is that the reason why President Trump got up there and said 90,000 manufacturing plants have closed? And it's not all because of moving the manufacturing over to foreign countries. It's because of automation.
A lot of it is automation. I don't know which numbers he's getting from where, but the total number of manufacturing establishments is pretty steady in the last 10 years. It's gone up and down over the last 5 decades, but it hasn't just dropped. And look, and again, like even if it did, that doesn't change the income figures. The middle class folks, the folks at the lower end of the income distribution, they've all been doing very, very well. In many cases, many points during the last 5 decades, people in the lower end of the distribution have had higher income growth than people at the higher end of the distribution. And throughout all this time, all of our manufacturing stats have been going up. We produce more stuff than we ever have. We have more productivity, basically since ever. All of our manufacturing output is close to an all-time high. We're basically the global leader in value added per worker. So that's a productivity measure. If you look at some individual examples like steel, like that's a favorite one of the so-called Rust Belt. Steel in 1980, one steel worker in an hour couldn't even produce a tenth of a ton of steel. But now one worker produces almost 2 tons of steel in an hour. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like that across all different industries. So, by definition, you don't need as many people.
Right, and then the irony is you don't need as many people, and yet a lot of these industries, I know guys in the steel business have trouble finding finding workers, and particularly finding workers who are American citizens. So, I mean, at the same time, those two dynamics that sort of counter the narrative. I wonder if you have an exception, sort of philosophically, for what you hear a lot, which is sort of the things that are core to our national security. Let's talk, pharmaceuticals, rare earths, and items related to the defense industry. Should those be treated, separately from the promotion of general free trade?
No. No, I mean, I'm going to say no here. Look, when it comes to pharmaceuticals, there's a lot of different moving parts to that, but it's simply not true that we're dependent on China for all of our pharmaceuticals. The supply chains are very diverse. Could they be more focused here? I suppose so, but I mean, this is not, it simply, again, is not the case that we're sitting here dependent on China for something in particular. If you look at the way pharmaceuticals are made, electronics are made, cars are made, they're made by combining different things, different skills, different things from all over the world. It's just, I don't accept the premise in the first place, I guess. So, no, I don't. If there was one specific exception that we had to make, I guess I'd be open to listening to that, but that's certainly not what I'm hearing.
What about semiconductors?
Well, again, the United States is part of the supply chain and the process of making semiconductors, and it doesn't, the way manufacturing has evolved, that does not mean that any one particular country will do all semiconductor production of all kinds from start to finish across the board, even in Taiwan, even in Korea. So, those are some of the dominant places where they're put together, but it's not the case that we're literally dependent on a politician there to flip a switch and say you don't get any more.
But I mean, just with semiconductors, I mean, we did see during COVID when politicians all over the place were flipping switches that when you disrupt the supply chain, I mean, you did have a real semiconductor shortage in this country, and so it's not, it doesn't turn off the spigot completely, but it definitely presents a problem.
Well, when you do something like what we did in COVID, you have shortages of all kinds, and we did have shortages. I mean, we had toilet paper shortages. I mean, that's a mess, So trade restrictions and tariffs. That's not necessarily the answer. You could just as easily make the case. I mean, if you listen to the people manufacturing these things, even iPhones. Part of the problem is the high skilled labor shortages in the United States, and people don't want to hear this, but an American is an American, and it doesn't matter if that American has Indian descent, Chinese descent, Japanese descent, any other country. If we attracted more high skilled labor, then that would be one way to defray some of those concerns.
Well, and
we made.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting too. I mean, that these companies, move like speedboats, where governments move like battleships, and so we saw that already with Apple. Apple just moved production of their iPhones not from China to the United States, but from China to India, and so it's shipping through India now, which doesn't have zero tariffs because they got hit too, although the pause is on. But they have lower tariffs, and it speaks to what the cost of production Apple believes it would be in the United States versus in India that got hit with a 25% tariff.
That's right. Oh, that's right. That's a great example. It's also a great example of how nimble any of these companies can be, when pushed up against the wall, so to speak. But the core problem there, again, that's having the data scientists and the engineers and the highly educated workforce that's necessary to not just design, but to build and to manufacture and to assemble these things. And, that's something that we haven't had here. We haven't fostered it here. We've actually been pretty difficult in terms of immigration, and that doesn't help us. That hurts us.
Norbert Michel is Vice President, Director of the Cato Institute Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. Norbert Michel, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
This is Carol Platt-Liebau for townhall.com. We've got yet another horrible idea emanating from California. A new